It's past the 5-year anniversary of the 2019 general election, that huge win for Boris Johnson, which redrew the political map and enabled him to, in his words, get Brexit done.
I'm sure you've seen that film, Sliding Doors, where it shows different things could have happened if someone had just been slightly later into a train. And there were many, many moments like that in the Brexit shenanigans that went on prior to the 2019 election. We spend a lot of time blaming different people for Brexit. A lot of blame goes into farmers. A lot of blame goes to Boris Johnson. But really, in fact, if we dig deeper, there's a lot that went on in that process that began in 2015 when David Cameron won the election with a mandate to hold a referendum, and when it was actually delivered in the 2019 election by Boris Johnson. And recently on Times Radio, there was a discussion about why Jo Swinson called an election or capitulated and allowed Boris Johnson to call an election together with the SNP. And it is fascinating to go back over this and think exactly who did what.
It wasn't that far away from passing the Chequers deal, but the problem was that there were a lot of people in the Labour Party who opposed it because they wanted to reverse Brexit.
If Labour had passed the Chequers deal, they would have brought down Theresa May. The government would have been shattered. The Conservative Party would then not have been able to win the general election. It was a fundamental miscalculation, and we could have easily ended up with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister.
Well, look,
Keir Starmer, by the way, is part of why they made that mistake.
I didn't want to introduce any spoilers for this.
Jeremy Corbyn was half-hearted at best in the campaign for the referendum, and he came out with that famous, the EU's 7 out of 10 and it doesn't really matter. And then after the vote happened, he was calling for Article 50 to be triggered, and he caused huge division within the Labour Party, which actually is why it ended up being such a mess. And that is why Danny Finkelstein acknowledges that the Labour Party's failure to take advantage of passing Theresa May's deal, which he blames on Keir Starmer, interestingly enough. If Theresa May's deal had passed with Labour votes, it would have brought Theresa May down and Brexit would have been killed, because Brexit would have happened and Theresa May's deal would have been delivered. We would have been in some form of permanent transition, and there would have been an election, and the Labour Party likely would have won with Jeremy Corbyn as the leader.
We've had a question from Imran. He says, still, I've never really understood why Jo Swinson agreed to an election in 2019. We should remind people a bit of the context here. Basically, Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings desperately wanted an election to break the Brexit deadlock and to get a majority in Parliament. The Fixed Term Parliament Act meant that they couldn't. They had to get MPs to vote for one. The opposition parties didn't want him to have one. Labour had been calling for an election for quite a long time and then really backed away when it looked like one might happen. But then the Lib Dems and the SNP decided to go for it anyway. Polly, why?
They thought they'd do really well.
Wow.
So you have to remember, though, that because Brexit had been postponed back in the spring, there were European elections. And so MEPs were elected for, lame duck MEPs. And the Liberal Democrats had done very well in that context, because that was an election that was about Brexit, and the Lib Dems were able to be, alongside the Greens, a strong vocal voice saying we shouldn't leave. European Union's great. And they assumed that given that this was going to be a general election that was also about Brexit, just like the European elections were, that whilst, Nigel Farage's kind of forces might also do well, they would be the only party able to clearly say, it's not too late to stop Brexit, we can stop Brexit. And there was a demographic for that, right?
That was the policy. The policy was to reverse, it wasn't even a referendum, it was to reverse Brexit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If they got a majority, they would reverse it. Otherwise, they would use whatever power they had to block it or reverse it or do anything. I think the problem was that that neither the Conservatives nor particularly the Liberal Democrats really ran it as a Brexit election. It was get Brexit done. That was a sort of headline thing. But actually, the Conservatives then moved on, I think rightly, in terms of strategy terms, to talking about the number of hospitals they're going to build and the number of nurses they're going to hire. And, it was Brexit plus. And then for the Lib Dems, they barely talked about Brexit at all because they got frightened, I think, of the fact that their policy was pretty bold and controversial. And so they then also went into talking about the NHS and talking about public service reform and local government. And you think, well, if your intellectual proposition is there are still people who want us to stay in the European Union and that's the votes that we want, you need to make it a drop everything, stop Brexit campaign. And they just didn't. They barely talked about Brexit at all.
And the acknowledgement that Jo Swinson took the decision to go with the SNP and call an election in 2019 because she thought she could win. There's something that's missed out here in Polly's diatribe, is that when we ran the European elections, Vince Cable was the leader, and Vince Cable was actually very popular in the country and had a lot of respect. Jo Swinson was absolutely unknown, and that was the biggest problem, that she thought that she could win, and that was based on polling that was done in the August-September time. And the reason that polling was favouring the Lib Dems was because of the Brexit Party. And it was the Brexit Party that actually polled those seats where they actually didn't in this last election, which then meant that it worked against the Liberal Democrats, and that's why the Conservatives picked up the win in 2019. It was largely Nigel Farage's decision in 2019 which gave Boris the majority, and it was Nigel Farage's decision to not do that same which gave Keir Starmer the majority in this latest election.
I mean, Get Brexit Done was basically a let's stop talking about Brexit campaign.
Well, exactly.
Really, wasn't it?
It was a time for a change campaign run by an incumbent government, very successful. Brilliant campaign. My view is that it was due to a fundamental misunderstanding of the electorate, both their views on Brexit and their views about how Parliament had behaved. And it was, I'm afraid, it was a bubble thinking. Right. I mean, I hate that term normally because it's annoying, but it was lots of people who all thought Brexit was insane, thinking that everybody thought that and nobody would want to implement this ridiculous decision. Everybody would want a second referendum. And I, from the word go, always thought that the calling for a second referendum was a forlorn cause, that people would be totally opposed to it, that anybody who proposed doing it was going to lose as a result of doing it. And it pains me to see all of the energy of lots of intelligent, capable people going behind this obvious loser. And that didn't surprise me. But if you believed this was a gigantic winner and that you could unite behind you all the people that Jeremy Corbyn couldn't unite because he was being so hesitant, then of course you would take that position. So I think, I said to Polly, I'm sure you're a person who understands better than any of the rest of us why she did that. But I think that sounded like a very plausible explanation. They thought it was a winner. And I could not believe they thought it was a winner. It's extraordinary to me.
The dishonesty around the Brexit referendum continues. In truth, no decision was made in 2016, and by the time we got to the 2019 election, opinion had moved in favour of remaining in the European Union and having a second vote. But it ended up that Brexit won with only 43% of the popular vote, and the majority voted for parties which wanted to remain in the European Union. And there was absolutely every right for the Liberal Democrats to say that we wouldn't need another vote had they won a majority, because it's the same as Boris Johnson saying he would get Brexit done if he got a majority. That is when major decisions are made in general elections, not referendums.
The only caveat is that the Liberal Democrats at the time had, 12 MPs? So your definition of a winner is, of course, different to what a minority party is. If the Liberal Democrats, and of course they didn't, but if they'd managed to surge to 25 MPs, right?
13 MPs.
13, forgive me. But so
Yes, I get that.
I'm saying they thought that they would do very well. I agree that they were wrong about that. All I'm saying is they were probably slightly less nuts than you might think, only because their definition of do very well is quite different from what you would expect if you are like Danny or Peter, used to thinking of doing well as an election being actually winning it, which is obviously not something that Democrats are expected to do.
So I accept this.
But of course, I mean, she was wrong.
The problem is, I accept that. That's an important correction to the conversation. But the thing is, you'd have to believe that there were 25 places in the country where that was actually a majority opinion, and that it would become the leading majority opinion. So therefore, you would be in places where Labour was, the primary party, and you were second, which isn't really where the Liberal Democrats were.
But I mean, that's basically why they ended up as not the second referendum party, because by then I think Labour wanted a second referendum, did they?
Yeah. So the moment I heard that they'd produced this policy, and I remember arguing in our news conference at the Times, this will turn out to be a terrible policy. And when I realised that the twist to it was they would only implement it if they won a majority in Parliament, because they would interpret the majority in Parliament as having been the second referendum, I thought, my goodness, that will be lost on everyone.
The reason why people in the Labour Party favoured the second referendum was that they thought that was the only way in which you had a chance of reversing Brexit. You certainly weren't going to succeed in reversing Brexit by asking the country to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. There are too many reasons why they wouldn't do so. That was the view of many in the Labour Party and many of the anti-Brexiteers. Not least because Jeremy Corbyn was so ambivalent about Brexit. I mean, formally he was against it, but every piece of body language on his part suggested that he was quite happy for it to go through, which is possibly why he voted for the holding of that general election in 2019, because he didn't mind that much or that fundamentally whether Brexit happened or not.
I mean, I remember, Danny, when finding out that the Lib Dem policy was simply to reverse Brexit in that election, because you told me, you came into the office saying it, and I said, shut up, I thought you were joking. And I was like, no, and so there was I remember a big conversation on that. But Peter, is it possible for an opposition party to not want an election?
It's very, very difficult, and I had some sympathy for the Labour leadership at the time, because if you say you don't want to have a general election, it suggests that you're not confident of winning it, which is hardly a great way to...
I did think, by the way, I did think for Parliament to decide they had no confidence in the government's central policy, but still to hold out against having an election. It did illustrate why that policy of the fixed-term parliaments couldn't work. And actually, from a constitutional point of view, I'm very glad that we should all be grateful that Jo Swinson did it. To be in a position whereby the government could neither push its main policy through Parliament, could not govern the country according to its own lights, and yet Parliament refused to allow there to be a general election, that really would have been unacceptable. So it was right that there was a general election.
But wasn't that the point of the Fixed Term Parliament Act? I mean, Polly, as a sort of Lib Dem initiative, wasn't it basically so that government had to rise and fall and take into account a third party without an election, thereby empowering a third party?
Yes.
Yeah.
The point is a parliament, a mature parliament that was used to fixed terms, as is kind of normal around the world, I think would be much more able to resolve its own problems. I mean, those endless meaningful votes around Brexit were absolutely Parliament failing to just accept that it needed to come to a decision. And I think it's, so many MPs at that point sort of wanted Brexit to go through, but without them having to have voted for it so that they could say it wasn't their fault, either because the deal was not strong enough or because the deal was too weak, whichever perspective you had. That's the problem, is that major constitutional change, like introducing fixed terms, isn't something you can just do on a whim. You have to, it needs to bed in and be accepted as a genuine constraint on MPs, and that's just not the way our MPs think about
The
themselves.
problem for Parliament at that time was that there were so many different fault lines running through it. It wasn't just, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem and the rest. It was pro and anti-Brexit. And amongst the anti-Brexiters, there was a division between those, who imagined that it could and should be reversed by means of a second referendum, and those who said, look, it's not going to be reversed. The fact is that a democratic decision has been taken, and people are not going to sit back and simply say, well, that was the country's view then, and let's hope and assume that the country will vote opposite. They said, look, we got to have the least worst deal.
But that's
so
true. But the
division,
government,
the fault line between those who wanted to reverse it and those who wanted to mitigate, the consequences of Brexit, was a very big fault line that ran through each of the parties. And in the case of the Conservatives, there were Brexiters. There were people who wished their country had never voted in that way, but they knew that if they went for a second referendum, it would split the Conservatives from top to toe, and therefore they couldn't possibly support one. It was very difficult. There were so many different fault lines.
But all of that is true. What was sort of depressing, though, as somebody who at the time thought we should just come to a deal, is that nobody within
least
Parliament,
worst deal.
or frankly any old deal, but that everybody could agree on, right? That maybe not everybody, but that Parliament ought to, at that moment, have tried to find a consensus position which a majority could support. But the problem was that Theresa May couldn't move off relatively extreme positions, because to make a compromise with the Labour Party,
because she got to the Chequers deal.
But if the Chequers deal had to be got through with Labour votes, it was somehow considered therefore toxic. When to me, a fundamental principle is that every parliamentarian has a legitimate voice, and it shouldn't just be reliant on the votes of one party.
It wasn't that far away from passing the Chequers deal, but the problem was that there were a lot of people in the Labour Party who opposed it because they wanted to reverse Brexit.
If Labour had passed the Chequers deal, they would have brought down Theresa May. The government would have been shattered. The Conservative Party would then not have been able to win the general election. It was a fundamental miscalculation, and we could have easily ended up with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister.
Well, look, we should move on because we're running short on time. But look, I didn't say this earlier because I didn't want to introduce any spoilers.
Keir Starmer, by the way, is part of why they made that mistake.
I didn't want to introduce any spoilers to the discussion, but Jo Swinson lost her seat in the 2019 election, and the Lib Dems came out with one fewer seat than they went into it.
And just going back over what happened from 2015 to 2019, it is interesting from a historical context, but also it shows that our parliamentary system is broken. It was broken by Brexit, and parliamentary sovereignty to this day is broken. But really, in truth, it's been building up over many years that this system has broken, because two parties are vying for power in what is a very unfair, unbalanced system. And as we're seeing now with Keir Starmer, decisions are being made to hold on to power that are not representative of how the country is feeling. I think that is where we've got problems now. And going forward, we've now got more parties vying for power. So we've almost got so many parties that are gaining popularity, and we've got a first past the post system, which means that it's broken. And this has happened because of the Liberal Democrats breaking away from Labour, which was mostly about, actually in those days, the old-fashioned Brexit, because they were anti-EU, and that was under Michael Foot's day. And then the rise of the Reform Party, which began life as the Referendum Party, then it became UKIP, then it became the Brexit Party, and now it's the Reform Party. And this is meaning that the vote share is being broken up, and it means that someone can win these constituencies with a very small percentage of the vote, and that's what's going wrong here. We've got a party with a huge majority in power, but they've only got 34% of the popular vote, which is not enough. It's it's not enough to make big changes either. And that is why we're really experiencing turbulence, because Keir Starmer is deciding to deliver really unpopular decisions, and it's a miscalculation.